Okay, so for the past week, a bunch of politicians have been assembling inside of the House of Commons to debate the recent budget that was released last Monday. Now, it seems that after a week and over a week of debates, they've finally come to a conclusion and they've held a vote on this budget. But before this budget vote was actually held, there were some potential amendments added to this budget, which they also voted on. So in today's video, we're going to go over every single amendment that was potentially proposed, who proposed it, what the vote results were, and now finally what actually happened at the end on this final budget vote that just was happening at the beginning of this week. And if you're new to the channel, hey, how's it going? I'm Russell. We cover tons of Canadian content here on the channel, from news to investing to personal finance, a little bit of real estate. So consider subscribing if you haven't already done so, and check out the links in the description where you can join the Canadian Money Mastery program, where we teach everything that should have been taught in high school when it comes to money, how to save more, earn more, and invest more. So if you're interested in that, feel free to check it out. But now let's get into these budget amendments, who voted for them, who voted against them, as well as what this final vote result was. We'll get to at the end of the video. If you've been following this channel, you'll already know that we've gone over what's inside of this budget, and we've gone into some niche areas and talked about who's going to be receiving supports based on the Liberals' budget and who's going to have them taken away. So there's a lot of controversial things inside of the budget, but this is the opportunity for the other political parties to say, hey, here's what we would change about your budget. And we're going to start here with the Conservatives. This is an amendment that was proposed almost immediately after the budget came out by Ed Fast. Now, this is the Conservative critic for finance. It used to be Pierre Poilievre's job, but Erin O'Toole kind of kicked him out from that position and said, hey, Ed Fast, you take care of this now. And he proposed an amendment. Let's go over exactly what this amendment is. They say that the motion be amended by deleting all the words after the word that and substituting the following. Given that the budget adds over $500 billion in new debt that can only be paid through higher job-killing taxes, B, that it contains over $100 billion for a re-election fund while doing nothing to secure the long-term prosperity of Canadians, and C, it fails to rule out the introduction of a capital gains tax on the principal residences of Canadians currently being studied by the CMHC as a way to pay for the government spending, the House demands that the Liberal government budget be revised in order to focus on accelerating the vaccination plan to end the dangerous third wave of the COVID-19 pandemic and policies that will actually create jobs and stimulate economic growth. So that's what the Conservatives are pushing for to be included inside of this budget. So to break that down a little bit, some of the main problems they have, well, the first one is the huge amount of spending. I believe it's around $500 billion in new debt that's being taken on. We've already made a video here on the channel about this whole debt strategy that the Liberals have, sort of trying to push out the date that they're actually going to have to pay for all of this and some of the potential pros and cons and issues that you may have with that. I'll link it in the description, but that's one of the main issues that the Conservatives have here is that, hey, we're taking on a whole bunch of new debt and we don't really have a strong fiscal anchor here. Now, they also say that it contains over $100 billion for a re-election fund while doing nothing to secure the long-term prosperity of Canadians. This is in reference to some of the one-time payments that they're proposing are going out. Like, we're seeing a $500 support given to seniors in August, and they're saying, hey, well, that's kind of when an election might be. Are you just giving out money to people to buy votes for your re-election campaign? That's one of the critiques that the Conservatives had. And then this one, C, says it fails to rule out the introduction of a capital gains tax on the principal residence of Canadians. If you don't already know, this would be a big deal for homeowners who only own one home or are inside of their one primary residence, and when they go to sell it, well, typically you don't have to pay any tax or any capital gains tax on the value increase that you've seen in your home from when you bought it to when you sell it. And now the Conservatives are saying, well, the Liberal budget doesn't rule this out, but it's a little bit interesting here because I have been watching the House of Commons, and whenever the Conservatives ask this question to the minister responsible for housing, well, that minister says, we are not considering adding this capital gains tax. So it seems a little bit odd to me that the Conservatives are pressing on this point when they've had a Liberal minister come out and say, we are not even considering this. Interesting that they bring this up, but the point that they're trying to make here is that based on all of these things, we need them to revise the budget in order to focus on accelerating vaccination plans and actually ending all of this. Oh my goodness, did you hear that? It is raining here. Oh my goodness, that is some thunder. Okay, but what they're saying here is that the policies that will create jobs and stimulate economic growth, well, those policies aren't inside of this budget. Wow, what a storm. But now we need to get to the vote. Like, did they actually agree to make some of these changes that the Conservatives were looking for? Well, here is the vote result, and here's the summary of it. They had 120 in favor and 213 against. Now, this 120 in favor, well, that exactly corresponds to the amount of Conservatives in the House of Commons. So this vote essentially was all the Conservatives voted in favor of this amendment or this motion to amend the bill, and the rest of the people in the House of Commons, the Green, the Bloc Quebecois, the Liberals, the NDP, the Independents, well, they all voted against this motion. So it seems that this won't be considered by Chrystia Freeland. She's not going to make these amendments in the budget to change to what the Conservatives were looking for. But now let's get into the Bloc Quebecois, because the Bloc Quebecois actually also put in an amendment or a potential amendment that saw a change they wanted to see, and it has largely to do with seniors and the supports that they're getting and how they don't think that it's exactly fair the way the Liberals are going forward with creating sort of two classes of seniors, people between 65 and 75 and people older than 75 who will be receiving additional supports if this budget passes through unchanged. So let's see what Yves-François Blanchet had to say. This is the leader of the Bloc Quebecois, and when he actually proposed a further motion, it was actually like a sub-amendment to the amendment that the Conservatives are, but we can essentially view it as a separate amendment. And they say that because the budget does not include any increase to the Canada Health transfers, it abandons seniors between the ages of 65 and 75 because they're not receiving any additional supports inside of this budget, and by adding the words after economic growth, the following: support healthcare systems by increasing the Canada Health transfers to 35% of healthcare costs and contribute to the quality of life of seniors aged 65 and over by increasing old age security as of age 65 and dropping the age for the one-time payment of $500 for the summer of 2021 to age 65. So these are the main things that the Bloc Quebecois were pushing for. They said, hey, we need more health transfers. If you don't already know, the federal government largely funds the healthcare systems in different provinces, and the Bloc Quebecois have been heavily pushing for these healthcare transfers to be more dramatically increased than the Liberals have already committed to doing. Liberals say they're going to do it, but after the pandemic. The Bloc Quebecois want this to happen more quickly. And also, they take issue with the whole issue with seniors here, where they're creating two different classes of seniors, some who will receive supports over 75, and then between 65 and 75 won't. They largely believe that this is probably a cost-saving method from the Liberals, saying that, hey, well, we have to pay it out to far less people if we don't include people who are 65 to 75, so we're just going to provide support for those people who may already be in long-term care homes and may already be at that age where, at least in the Liberals' point of view, they actually need some extra funding. But now let's see if there was any traction gained on this motion. We'll scroll down here to the vote, and you can see not a lot of traction for this, unfortunately, for many seniors who would be in favor of this. There were only 37 positive votes and 297 nays. So again, this is likely just the Bloc Quebecois and maybe a couple independents voting here, and then everyone else voting against this change, largely because I think that it's not entirely detailed enough for the other parties to get on board with how they actually want this to be changed, if they want this to be amended and in what way, right? So not a lot of support for this amendment. So this is interesting. There were two amendments that were put forward. Both of them voted down. They couldn't get enough support in the House of Commons. But then finally, we had the vote on just the base budget with no changes. We're going to get into exactly what that vote was, what the results were, but also what that means for you. Do any of these changes actually come into effect? Well, let's dive into that now. So this is the exact text that everyone in the House of Commons voted on Monday, and the text was that this House approve in general the budgetary policy of the government. So that's what they're voting on, just passing this budget and saying, hey, we approve this in general. Now we'll get into why this doesn't actually mean anything is going to change in a moment, but let's get into what the vote results were. So we can scroll down here, and a far closer vote than the other votes. We had 178 in favor and 157 against it, right? 178 in favor, so that means that this motion has been agreed to. They've passed this motion saying that, hey, the House of Commons supports this budget in general. Now, these vote numbers, they're a little bit interesting, right? You know that the Liberals don't have a majority, so they couldn't just vote on this alone. So who was actually supporting them here? Well, if you've been following the channel, you might already know the answer, the NDP and Jagmeet Singh. Now, even before the budget was released, before all of these policies were actually explained in more depth, the NDP came out and said, we are not going to trigger an election during the pandemic. They said, we're not going to trigger an election. So essentially what that means, without them actually saying these words, is that we will 100%, no matter what's in the budget, support the Liberals because we don't want an election. Now, the NDP are saying they don't want the election because it would be irresponsible to bring Canadians to the polls during a pandemic for health reasons. Now, critics of the NDP will say that that's not actually that's what they're sort of saying to people, but they don't want an election because they likely wouldn't fare too well. They haven't made the gains that they've been hoping to before the next federal election, so it's likely that they don't want to see an election happening, and as a result, they're just like going to support the Liberals no matter what they do, no matter what they say, and that's what these vote results say. It was essentially the Liberals and the NDP voted in favor, and that was enough to pass it, even though everyone else from every other party largely was not in favor of this bill. But here's where things get interesting. Just because this motion was passed that they were going to support this bill in general in the House of Commons doesn't actually mean all that much, because for many of the measures that are inside of the budget, well, now that they have the support in general of the House of Commons, now is when they can start bringing actual bills, actual legislation forward to make the changes that are proposed inside of the budget. Just because this budget vote passed doesn't mean that anything specifically is going to change. Now, there are some things that can change without legislation, and these are things that can be controlled through regulation, right? Anything that has the ability to be changed and altered by the government without passing legislation, that would be regulation. There are certain aspects of that. I think back to when the CRB was extended the very first time, and they were able to do this without passing any legislation. They could just change the number because inside of the initial bill, they allowed for that flexibility in the government. So there might be certain things inside of this budget that can be changed like that, but for many of the larger programs, the larger changes, even potentially the change in the amount of money that is going to be handed out to people on CRB starting July, how that's going down, they may not be able to change that through regulation, so we'd have to wait and see what legislation and what bills are actually brought forward by the liberal government before we certainly have an idea of what's going to truly happen. And this gets into one of the biggest questions and one of the biggest complaints both from the Conservatives and the NDPs against the Liberal government. They say, hey, whether or not there's good things or bad things inside of this budget, the Liberal government has a track record of not doing what they say they're going to do. Hey, there was some great measures, the NDP say, inside of this budget. The national health care or child care plan. No national health care, much to the NDP's disappointment, but this national child care plan. Well, the NDP, they're pretty much in favor of this being pushed forward and being continued, but they don't believe that the Liberals are going to actually do it or are going to actually be able to take the action, pass the legislation through the House of Commons to get the support in order to implement programs like this. And the Conservatives think the same thing. It's like, hey, even if there are positive things inside of this budget, well, we don't have faith in the Liberal government to actually make it happen. So this is what we're going to have to keep our eyes open for the next little while, is to get a better idea on whether or not they're actually going to take care of these things that they said they're going to take care of, that hold true to these promises. Now, many people don't believe that the Liberals can do this, and that they have a history of promising big but not delivering. So we have to keep our eyes open and find out what's really going to happen here. But of course, you can count on this channel because I'm going to be keeping you informed whenever there's any new information about any changes to this, any new supports, any new programs, any changes to the way we're going to spend. All of this detail and all of this information you can find right here on this channel. So if you haven't already done so, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, and make sure to check out the links in the description where you can either learn about personal finance, investing, earning more, saving more right here in Canada, or you can open up your own investment accounts and start taking your wealth into your own hands. So important these days because even though there are government supports, we just simply cannot count on the government when it comes to our own personal finances. That's what I believe, and I think we need to take it into our own hands. So I recommend you taking a look at that. And with all of that said, thank you so much for watching, everybody. I really hope this video has helped you out at least a little bit, and I'll see you next time.
This channel is supported by viewers like you. Thanks, channel members.